So we'll resume and continue. So this morning we talked about some of the housing need figure and some of the issues around housing need. And this afternoon we're going to be looking at employment needs. Just a couple of new faces around the table. So obviously welcome along. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the special appointed to conduct the examination of the local plan. I noticed a couple of new faces around the table, so we just quickly go around the table. We're going to start the council. We just introduce ourselves, just let me know, say who you are and you ask on behalf of anybody in particular.
Yes, Paul Shadowrivian, QC, representing the council.
David Marlow, planning consultant representing the Borough Council.
Sharon Evans, Principal Planning Policy Officer, Borough Council.
Hilary Smith, Economic Development Manager, Borough Council.
Steve Bond, Head of Planning, Borough Council.
Troy Hayes, Managing Director of Troy Planning and Design, here on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council.
Stuart Gledhill, Chair of Safe Cape.
Okay. Is Mr. Neil joining us or
no?
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so as we did as we did this morning, we'll go through the matters, issues, and questions. We'll go through the questions there. I think there's 7 or 8 questions again. So I think we'll need to go through all of them, get a discussion going around some of the main issues. So the first question is all to do with employment needs and how the planning practice guidance provides advice on how needs should be assessed. So the first question was really about how the strategic policy making authority, in this case, some of us councillors, have considered issues such as labour demand, labour supply, and past take-up to understand and inform the plan. Now, we'll go through the council's response in great detail, but there is an economic needs study, I think it's called document 3.87, and there you said that you've looked at all these issues. You've looked at the past take-up of land, you've looked at the sort of labour demand and labour supply models as required by DPG, and then you converted that into a land requirement. And I think in the plan it sets out requirement for 14 hectares, I think, over the plan period.
That's correct.
And just for the sort of the basis of other people attending here, is it worthwhile just very briefly, I know these things become overly complicated, just very briefly, just identifying what that 14 hectares is based on.
Yeah, as we set out in our hearing statements, the council has maintained a robust and up-to-date understanding of business needs of this borough. A range of economic data has informed the local plan and meets the requirements of the PPG. And as you said, we're taking into account paragraphs 26 and 27 of the PPG and assessed through the economic needs study the labour demand, labour supply, and the past take-up. These have equated to a minimum requirement of 14 hectares, which is set out as the requirement within the local plan. And I think we set that out within the statement.
Yeah, and I think which leads to the question 2, where I asked if there's any significant differences in projections when using labour demand and labour supply and past take-ups. Is there any sort of real outliers or significant differences? And then obviously again you hear the statement there, you set out that essentially no, not really. They're also broadly similar, so there's no sort of outliers that you use to consider. So it was slightly lower for labour demand, but that was based on the old smart.
Slightly lower on labour supply.
Yeah.
But that was based on the old SMART figure, and so we updated it in our topic paper. It's been updated through the housing needs work with our senior, and that's taken account of that slightly higher labour supply and broadly aligns now.
Just figure out feels jumping at any stage. Some of these questions were sort of take quite high level. And so there's no need to restate the written statements. The evidence is in there. One of the issues that did stand out was projected decline in industrial use over the plan period. And I sort of said, does this reflect the local market? And again, I think you said that this is sort of based on wider national trends, which are then sort of aggregated down to a local level. I think presumably, is it fair to say, obviously, Tunbridge Wells, obviously been here for a couple of weeks now, various areas, had a good look around. We're not talking about, vast areas of sort of industrial land, it's now become derelict or vacant. It's not that sort of geography area, sort of that sort of make of a borough there. So again, that's just reflective of national trends, is it? Sort of locally specific issues here with regard to declining industrial land. One of the questions and issues that I did raise was the economic needs study was produced in 2016. Obviously, the framework on PPG talks about data which is current and robust. So one of the questions that I raised, and this has also been raised by other participants as well, is that data reliable? Is it current and robust for purposes of planning?
Yeah, and I think again, we set it out clearly in response to question 1 in our hearing statements. And we've set out within there, basically Appendix 1 sets out the evidence base in relation to employment needs. So that provides the details of the economic needs study, which is substantive evidence base in 2016. But then also recognising that there's been other further studies which have fed into the local plan preparation, and that's the retail and leisure study, the Tunbridge Wells hotel capacity study, the town centre office market review, and then an update of the sort of retail, commercial, leisure and town centre use study, which was in 2021, and that included an update of the town centre office market review as well. But what we've also done at Table 1 of my statement on page 4, we set out going back to your previous question on the paragraphs in the PPG 26 and 27 of what we need to do to identify employment land needs. We set those out where the evidence can be found in the economic needs study, but then also where there's further updated evidence and how we use that. So we've set that out in terms of where there's been updates and where we can find those updates and how that's informed the local plan. Then I think we've also set out a question in response to question 4, how we consider it, the evidence that we have is current and robust. And we've summarised on page 17 what we feel is the case that the industrial structure of the borough remains much the same. Borough's relationship with surrounding areas and wider economic geographies and relationships remain the same. The key infrastructure is much the same as it was in 2016, following the improvements around the A21. The status of the borough in terms of access to national or regional funding remains the same. I mean, the unemployment figures are similar, although we recognise there was a blip during the COVID pandemic. And then in terms of the stock of premises, town centre office market, obviously we've reassessed that through the updated work that we've carried out. We actually had local property agent Sterling's who carried out the 2018 town centre study, but they also fed into the Nexus 2021 update as well. So we use them to help inform that.
And what was just in the town centre office market studies, what was the basis of, or was the reason for the 2021 update?
In terms of the office market or the whole study, the 2021 is the whole study that we've
both really.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. It can come to it, I suppose, in a later session, but in terms of the retail evidence base that was carried out in 2017, that was one area that we felt did need to be updated. And so when we commissioned consultants to carry that work out, we broadened the scope of the 2017 study. So it wasn't just looking at retail, but it was looking at wider sort of commercial uses and picking up the town centre office market as well. It's a consideration in terms of the Article 4 directions that we'd had served on office buildings within Tunbridge Wells, and it's to update that work and further inform the local planning.
So can I just add, the chronology is quite important as well in terms of that's into an update. So in the draft local plan, the town centre, there was allocations for a large theatre to cater for touring musicals, together with a large office block as well. That's a council-led scheme. It fell away for political reasons solely. That coincided with the pandemic commencing in 2020, and as Mrs. Evans has set out, we were already aware of some of the changes to retailing. So the timing of the wider study in 21 picked up those two elements, the change to the council's approach to the theatre and the site allocations associated with that, the acceleration of changes to retail due to the pandemic, and some of the other societal changes that we were starting to see, including movements to working from home, etc. In addition to the points that this is mentioned.
Yeah, so there's two sort of issues. There's the issue around say sort of traditional B use classes, and by that I mean a typical sort of industrial sort of premises. So you talked about the structure of the borough remains the same, its relationship with other areas remains the same. I think one thing that we've all witnessed, and the representatives made this point, is this sort of changes to the town centre and how we shop and work and interact with town centres. And one of the issues, which I think we'll come on to talk in greater detail on when we look about the Green Belt review especially, but it's the point that representatives have made is about maximising the use of existing land and buildings. So when the council went back in 2021, I think you said it wasn't, and again, he broadened the evidence base. It wasn't just looking at retail, he started to look at office uses as well. What was the purpose of that? Was it reflecting the pandemic? Was it intended to critically assess what stock you've got out there that could be used for housing? What was the sort of purpose behind it?
Probably the fourth element. So again, moving from the draft local plan to the pre-submission local plan, you'll note in the draft local plan there are a series of more specific allocations within the town centre, recognising, and this was what the advice from the 2020-2021 Nexus study recommended, a town centre area plan to look specifically at the town centre, for it to be a local plan specific to that area, and to accommodate and reflect those changes and what we were seeing. And as part of that, you'll note the change in the indication for residential allocations in the policy, specifically to the town centre, which has a figure within it. And so in terms of looking to maximise, make sure that housing provision within the town centre could be maximised through that area.
Okay, so just take me to that.
to policy STR RTW 2. And then it's point 8 within that. Page 81 of the submission version of the local plan. Point 8. Which sets out that in addition to those sites which already have planning permission in the town centre area boundary or are subject to detailed allocations, 150 to 200 additional residential units.
Okay, so that figure then, so what's that based on? Was that derived from this additional work area in 2021?
It was based on the Nexus report doesn't set out a specific figure. That was based on the council's understanding of potential sites that could come forward. It was based on the thoughts for the fact that the Nexus report set out that there could be scope for increased residential. The Nexus report also outlined the changes to permitted development. Timing wise, was fortunate that the changes to permitted developments have been introduced. Whilst they were ahead of them starting their work on that.
So it was reflective of changing circumstances, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. It was, so timing wise, there had been the first lockdown during the course of the undertaking of work. Things were then opening up again, so they were able to make judgments and recommendations based on the reopening of the economy and so on, albeit, and the report is clear on this, it was undertaken at a particular point in time before there had been a full return to a steady state.
So as far as the whether or not sort of the data supporting plans is current and robust, Council's position then that whilst the economic needs study is 2016, it is still justified, it's still robust for the reasons you've set out. Obviously changes that we've heard with regards to office developments, especially then consider that through further evidence. And so none of this points to, I think I will sort of get into the discussion about citing greenbelt, but in terms of actually economic development needs and employment needs, there's nothing there to suggest that actually anything fundamentally needed changing, and actually the employment requirement is still robust.
Thank you. I think one of our main points is about the evidence, the economic needs study 2016 was undertaken in 2016. However, the actual evidence itself in terms of the assessment of the land requirements in Sevenoaks and Tunbridge Wells are actually based on older evidence. So as far as I could tell from reading that study, and I think that is the principal evidence base that the councils use to determine their economic development needs. I think there's three. So it's based on labour demand is one of the options they looked at, labour supply, and past take-up, as far as I can understand, as far as I understand what they've produced in that evidence base. So the labour demand was based on the Oxford Economics 2014 EEFM evidence, and that was 2014. So we're talking 8 years ago from now. The labour supply was based on, it was a trend-based demographic projection from the 2015 SHMA. So presumably that's around seven years old. And then the past take-up, based on past take-up of employment land. We assume this is based on past take-up at the time of the economic needs study in 2016. And we think things have probably really moved on since 2016 because of the pandemic. And it is really important because the numbers, when you look at your question too about are there any differences between the different scenarios that were tested, there are a lot of differences actually between B1, B2, B8 between those projections, and it has a really big impact in terms of what amount of deployment land you actually allocate at the end of the day. We set it out in our hearing statement that, in terms of offices, I think it's a difference between 4.5 hectares looking at 2013 to 2035 between the three projections. It could be, that's the difference between the three B uses in terms of land. Industrial, there's a difference of nearly 7 hectares, and with warehousing, there's a difference of about 1.5 hectares. So that question around offices and industrial really does have a big impact in terms of the amount of additional employment. If you have to find greenfield for employment land, that really does have a significant impact on the amount of land you're looking at. And we've been talking on all the hearing sessions so far about, how has the council arrived at its, conclusion about it has to go into the green belt, AO and B, and areas of high flood risk. But then it can find, significant amount of land for employment uses. So I think it's quite a critical bit of evidence that we need to really examine.
In terms of the labour supply, I think you looking at the table, there was a table within the council's hearing statement, isn't it, which shows all the different land requirements based on labour supply, labour demand, task taken, etc. Yes, the study's based on 2016, but if you think if the study was redone, do you think it would come out with any significant differences? And if so, where would those differences be? So we've heard about how based on previous SMARs, etc. And we talked about the differences now with standard methodology, so different numbers of housing. Where do you think the differences, Mr. Hayes, would be if we redid it?
Well, I think this question about the town centre is a really important question, and I think that what we heard was that a lot of the evidence that was prepared was kind of focused on retail. Sort of Article 4. Are there any kind of additional, what's the vacancy rates in the town centre? The council being told that they need to undertake a town centre plan to look at, how much housing could they actually accommodate within the town centre. And we're told that they came up with a figure of between 150 and 200, which seems incredibly low to me. If you were going to come in with such a low number for housing, you'd expect that there'd be more potential sites within the town centre or within Tunbridge Wells for employment, if there is such high vacancy rates. So I think it's difficult to say what I think the study might conclude, but I think if we were to look around at other economic studies that are being undertaken at the moment, I think that the world has changed really considerably since 2014 when some of this evidence base was prepared. So I wouldn't want to sort of prejudice that piece of work, which I think does still need to be undertaken. And I think what you'd expect the council to have done at the same time back in 2021 was a kind of employment land review, probably alongside some sort of urban capacity study, given their exceptional circumstances case that they're making for Greenbelt, rather than also relying on their windfall allowance instead of bringing in sort of small site allocations, which we know the NPPF says that council should be doing. So they just haven't really looked very carefully at their urban supply, or I think at their sort of B2 supply that could actually yield more housing or a mix of housing and employment, like we see in a lot of other local authority areas.
Within that breakdown, there's the figures for office has taken significantly less, but they're generally pretty small figures in that context. Is there any evidence out there to suggest, I asked you the question on the spot really, but is there any evidence within the core documents or that's being produced which suggests that actually, that this how employment land requirement is fundamentally unsound for example?
I think what we find is that the council's over allocated by about double the amount that they should have.
Yeah, we'll come on to that, but just in terms of the actual requirement figure, is there anything to sort of suggest, well, hang on a minute, something significant has happened within the local market from 2016 to now that suggests that no, this is fundamentally wrong.
I mean, I think that the elephant in the room is obviously, COVID pandemic and how it has has changed everything. So I think that, because I can't come up with evidence that doesn't, exist. So I think it's something that's, widely sort of agreed that has really changed the economic picture for most places. But I can't point you to anything right at the moment.
Same question to council raised. Is there any evidence out there that suggests that no, these figures, are fundamentally unsound and justified, even taking into account obviously the pandemic?
I suspect we could all answer a bit of this, so and I'm sure Mr. Bourne will want to. I think just on the supply, obviously you appreciate the actual housing, the supply, labour supply has been updated through the ICB work. There haven't been any obvious sectoral changes. The industrial, we've monitored where things have been going, and it's included in the report, reference to the county council economic data, which supports that. I personally have a feeling that industrial strategies will become more important due to the international picture, and there are sort of generally perhaps the office, the actual amount of employment land you need for us and the number of jobs will be greater. But essentially the evidence that's been all the bits within the economic needs study have been reviewed and updated where they've been found to be needing updating, and obviously the town centre office side is one aspect of it. My understanding though is, and Mrs. Smith will perhaps elaborate, is that there is still demand out there.
I was just going to mention a couple of things, if that's all right. We have recently done a business survey of about approximately 200 businesses in the borough as part of our review of our economic development strategy. And as part of that, we have asked about the impact of COVID. And just a couple of the headlines to share are that there was only a very small amount of redundancies made during the COVID pandemic, thanks to the furlough scheme. We already had feedback that turnover of businesses is returning to pre-lockdown levels. So 50% of the businesses that responded said they'd already recovered or had exceeded pre-lockdown turnover, in fact, and a further 25% expected to recover within the next year. In terms of sort of changing patterns of work, 50% of the respondents said their staff were returning to their previous place of work, and another 22% said they were moving to hybrid working. So still certainly, use of employment workspaces. I think that those figures are borne out by national figures as well. The survey also showed that there had been some delays in recruitment due to the pandemic. So again, that attempts to recruit may take place now following the end of that. And then we've also received some intelligence from Locating Kent, which is the investment body for Kent, and they have said that there is in fact, pre-pandemic, there was a strong demand for flexible office space, and that trend has accelerated since the pandemic. Currently, they've got 20 investors looking for property to lease as flexible workspace or acquire or lease as flexible workspace And they've specifically mentioned North and West Kent as well. So we say that is sort of current intelligence that there is demand.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I've got 2 points to make, but before I do, I'm just want a little bit of clarification. We talked about 14 hectares being the requirement in the plan for employment space. Yet I noticed there's 13.4 at King's Standard and about 12 at Paddock Wood. So I'm not quite understanding where that 14 fits in. I'll make it nearly 30. It's in your master statement, so okay.
24 is the table. Table 2.
Yeah, I think that's question 7, which we'll come on to, which is the, you've identified a need for 14, but the sites will provide
More than 14.
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's question 7. So
Okay.
we'll come on to the implications of
Okay, so the 2 points I want to make. The first point was really, and you mentioned yourself just now, is that in terms of Tudley and the Garden Village, which is being proposed on the basis of a sustainable development, it's surprising not to see any employment space identified in that table. And you may wish to come on to it later, but it's rather surprising that sort of 5,000 people will effectively be, by inference, commuters, which is completely against the sustainability arguments in the plan. And the second point I want to come on to is that State Capital is encouraged by the fact that councils recognise the need to consider the post-pandemic world and the development of the town itself here, which we set out answering the first question this morning. But it kind of goes back to the other question 4 that we briefly touched on, which is about when the plan was submitted to, on an accelerated basis, to avoid being caught by the 30-year horizon. And that does question why they didn't hold back and carry out a post-pandemic review of the town centre's needs, and therefore the impact on whether so much greenbelt was needing to be released.
So if I can just go back to the point before, and then perhaps if you want to address the points everyone's together with it. In terms of is there any evidence or is there anything which suggests that the evidence base isn't up to date? I'll just draw attention back to the Nexus report, which really echoes the information which Mrs. Smith relayed. It identifies in terms of office the change in the nature of office requirements, more co-worker space, more flexible offices, and actually identifies that Tunbridge Wells, given the nature of a lot of the office buildings, character buildings, etc., within the town are suitable for that. There's commentary in here about the service of Article 4 directions, the recommendation that in addition to the 20 Article 4 directions on offices that were served previously, that further be served, and a recognition that a number of the office buildings are listed, all demonstrative of the changing demand, but still demand for offices in the town centre, and it also picks up and covers, as we said before, other elements around retailing, food and beverage, etc., and how that's expected to change in due course. So again, there's nothing that we're aware of that is suggesting that the evidence used to underpin the local plan isn't accurate, and if anything, the information that Mrs. Smith has relayed there aligns with what that underlying evidence was. And so in terms of well, actually, I was there unless you want us to address the points.
Yeah, please, if you could just just a clarification really on the Tudor Village strategic site then. So what, as we'll of course discuss this on the site level, what is proposed there in terms of employment uses?
Yeah.
You ask my colleague, Mrs Young, to answer that.
So there is, you'll note from policy SCR SS3, which is the main Tudor Village policy, that within the appropriate mix of uses for a garden settlement, reference is made to the need for employment. And I think there's a specific question within matter 6, issue 1, on this matter, which we address in terms of what we mean by employment. It's not allocated as a key employment area, and not designated as such in our local plan, because that's not the sort of type of employment that's envisaged. It's the sort of offices and workspaces and employment generating uses such as retail and commercial on that. And in the Hadlow Estate Delivery Strategy, which is attached to the Hadlow Estates Regulation 19 consultation, and apologies, I don't have the reference in front of me, but it's within our hearing statements on matter 6. It sets out what's envisaged. So we have provided the policy framework to enable the variety of uses within the garden settlement to create the internalisation of trips that was referred to, and that includes employment, but it's not proposed to be allocated as a key employment location or area.
And so if I could just then pick up on the point about the timing of the submission of the local plan. There was no acceleration. I think we relayed this in the Choose to Cooperate session. The council's existing development plan is old. Many of the policies are out of date. The council's been working at pace for 4 or 5 years to prepare the local plan. The pandemic occurring, and the council had regard to that, and the Nexus work is a good example of updated evidence to reflect that. But equally, the Department for Communities, Levelling Up, Housing were clear throughout the pandemic that authorities should continue to progress with the production of their local plans, and accordingly the council did so, mindful of the December 2023 deadline.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the table 1 of the economic needs study, which I talked about just briefly before, it sets out the land sort of requirements by the different B uses. And I think what we just heard from the council was that the B1, A and B offices are more attracted towards sort of town centre locations, such as Tunbridge Wells, in sort of historic character properties, flexible working, these types of things. And in this table, it shows the need for offices of around between 6.3 and 1.8 hectares. However, it does sound like the trends have changed since this study was undertaken, and you wouldn't really need 6 hectares of office land, to be allocated, because you may already have those buildings within your. It's more about floors, providing floor space for offices in terms of conversions or empty buildings within town centres. So I guess the question is what element of the overall sort of land requirements that the council's using are assumed for offices. I think we've just heard that they probably don't need a lot of large greenfield sites to house new offices, and then you're left with the B1C and B2 industrial, which has a range of declining need for that, or almost sort of 3 hectares of some of that becoming vacant that could be used for alternative uses. But based on past take up, it's sort of 5 hectares. So I think based on what we just heard, you could potentially remove or greatly reduce that need for the office land within the overall employment land requirement in the local plan.
Want to come back on that specific point about the office?
So in terms of offices within the town centre, the nexus of policies is clear on that. In terms of other employment, I think it's probably worth turning to table 2, which is in response to question 6, which identifies the employment round allocations within the local plan, and planning applications are progressing. Indeed, outline consent has been granted on the largest of those. There is clearly a demand. It's driving those applications forward. Both are speculative proposals, but the engagement with the applicants for those, they are confident that there is the demand for that employment provision. Indeed, as set out, reserve matters discussions are underway for the submission of the first phase of the largest sites. The other 2 sites are being actively promoted through the local plan. In particular, the site at land east of Transpeter Road.
In terms of the evidence, this leads on to the next question. The economic needs study covers a period, I think, of 2035. Don't think the dates are exactly the same as the plan period. Is that an issue, do you think? Or is it something that we wrapped up as part of the 5-year review?
I'm just coming on that one. Yes, we acknowledge that within the in our hearing statement, but it's set out clearly in the economic development topic paper. So if you have a look at that, paragraph 4.7 to 4.15 of the economic development topic paper, and we explain how the approach that we've carried out, recognising that we needed to address that issue, that the plan period that the ANS covering 2035, and we needed to update that to correlate with the submission of the plan period from 2020 to 2038. So we sought to update that, and we set out our methodology for doing that within the topic paper. And then at the end of that, it concludes that taking account of the framework that we did, that the minimum 14 hectares would still be
yeah, and I have further questions on that. I think obviously clearly there's bigger issues to discuss, and I think it doesn't correlate with the plan period by 2 years, but it's obviously at the end of the plan period, plans have to be given 5 years. So any changes will be acceptable. So I think that's fine as it is.
So, do you mind if I just clarify? I think it's a coincidence that both figures are 14 hectares, but the actual requirement has been rolled forward to 2038. Just double checking you'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, although the evidence it's essentially a linear roll forward. Sorry.
And that goes back to some of the wider sort of difficulties with this. I think things change. I think that's why there's that requirement to obviously review every 5 years and update as necessary. There might not be an update, but that's why it's there. It's saying that you need local authorities to respond to changing circumstances.
Yeah, I think the point you just made actually is perhaps a good example of an early review, because clearly the effects of the pandemic will perhaps be clearer in the next 2 or 3 years from where we are now. I'm grateful for your patience, sir. I want to go back to the point. I'm grateful for Ms. Young's reply on the policy SS3, which does identify that some form of employment is necessary. It's quite alarming because when I look at the paragraph 26 of your matter statement today, you talk about an increase in labour supply of between 9,000 and 9,500, and yet Tudorley perhaps is of the order of 5,000 people. So it's incredibly alarming that there's no key employment area identified to deal with that, given it's around about half of that figure.
We'll come on to discuss this on the Tuesday day, but it is something I think we'll return to because you mentioned the it's one of the annexes to the site promoters Road 19 responsible development strategy, because it's got in there. It has various detail and land use diagrams, etc. So I think this is a topic that we will return to. I think the Tudorley Village Day is probably the more appropriate day to do that, because it talks about, and appreciate that this is, it's a local plan examination, it's not a plan application as before, but nonetheless it does talk about, nearly 11,000 square metres of commercial development. So I think the points that Mr. Gledhill made are something that we do need to discuss, and I think there's questions on that Tuesday day around exactly this point. What land uses are proposed? Is it clear? Will it lead to out commuting? All these sorts of issues.
Yeah, I'm grateful. So I deliberately didn't want to get into the questions that clearly we need to address in detail to sit, and perhaps later in the week. But just in the context of what we're discussing here about I'm taking Mr. Hayes about whether the capacity level is actually justified. It's relevant to discuss it in the context of this, I believe. So that's why I've raised it this afternoon.
And it comes on to the next question, which is question 7, which is what you alluded to before about. Okay, so we talked about the requirement of 14 hectares and taking into account people's observations on that. So you've got this requirement of 14 hectares, but the plan actually allocates sites to provide around 26, 27 hectares, I think. Really allocated.
26.
Yeah, 26 hectares. In addition to what may or may not be provided as part of Tudorley Village. So again, what's the 2 questions raised? Firstly, what's the justification for this? And secondly, what's the implications if all that employment land is taken up? Obviously, it's far exceeding the actual requirement. What might be the implications of that? 2 questions really. First, what's the justification for obviously going sort of above, sort of almost sort of doubling that, and sort of secondly, what might the implications be?
Yeah, I think we've acknowledged that the paragraph 68 of our statement that the local plan does provide an supply of employment lands, and as we pointed out, the allocations equate to around 26.5 hectares. But we've considered that it's appropriate and proportionate in respect of the EPF, and see here paragraph 82 and 83 in planning positively and proactively for sustainable economic growth. And as Mr. Bourne has already pointed out, there are a number of allocations that have been provided for within the local plan to meet the employment needs, and they're set out at table 1 of the local plan and included in the statement on page 24. And it's Mr. Bourne's already talked through in terms of the current status of those sites that are allocated. The local plan table 1 just sets out the allocations, and it's helpful to provide an update on the status of those. So I think it's just it's helpful to acknowledge that in terms of, in particular, policy ALRTW 17, which has outlined planning permission already. But in terms of the oversupply, we think it's fully justified, and we set out paragraph 70 of the statement a number of reasons for that, and include the following sort of bullet points where we're talking about the previous constrained supply of employment land, and there's demand exceeding supply within the borough, and I think colleague Smith has referred to some recent information from Locating Kent as well, in terms of the demand for employment land. We wanted to ensure there was a sufficient size and range of sites across the borough. It comes back to some of your other questions about sort of quantitative needs as well as quantitative needs. The sites are allocated based on evidence within the economic needs study, and that's very much in terms of the assessment that was carried out for key employment areas across the borough, and the recommendation for the expansion of those key employment areas, recognising they're well located and there were very strong reasons for the expansion of some of those areas, in particular, again, at Longfield Road and also at Paddock Wood. We also think in terms of stimulating economic recovery following Brexit and COVID as well. Again, attracting inward investment to the borough, and really the requirement being a minimum within the plan. So I think, summarising, yes, we appreciate there's no supply, there's a significant allocation in ALRTW 17, and that's strategic contribution to provision, and that's set out quite clearly in the plan, in policy STR1 and also within ALRTW 2 as well, in terms of the ALRTW 1 in terms of the strategy for Tunbridge Wells itself as well.
So I just sort of add to that. I think Mr. Evans has set that out. I think, you can understand where someone's coming from. It looks at a generous supply, and across the plan area, that is true. But you've got to think, as has been said, in terms of the distribution of the supply and the nature of the supply. And in actual fact, we're looking at 4 allocations across the whole plan for the next 15 years. It's not a lot. And in fact, the only sites that have been identified are those that are specifically recommended in the employment needs study. And the points that Mrs. Evans referred to on sort of in paragraph 70 are important, but I just wanted to pick up on one in relation to RTW 17, which accounts for about half of the total supply. This is the site that is adjoining the North Farm key employment area, the largest employment area in the borough, and the economic or employment needs study, said this is the location, this is your strategic opportunity for development. Now that has been looked at. Yes, it's now got a planning approval, but it is one large site, and the boundaries make sense, and it's quite possible that not all of that site will be developed in the plan period. It's been the Greenbelt boundary has been redefined around it. So, in a sense, we have an enduring boundary. And whilst we could be fortunate and get sort of a lot of inward investments and coming in and wanting to take up that space, in essence, that provides the key resource in terms of flexibility for growth, both internally generated through relocation or expansion of existing firms and inward investment. But I think we'd recognise that it may well not be built out without a planned period, but the site itself makes sense as a site, and not least as a strategic site to sort of have that threshold of sort of opportunities for it to justify the investment.
So that's going to have the green light, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think that, or how would you respond to the criticisms that, you're oversupplying an employment land? So do the exceptional circumstances really exist? Start taking more land out of the green belt when you're already going to meet those needs through other sites that aren't in the green belt.
I think, as I said, the site that we're taking out of the green belt is just that site. That is the site. So, it was looked at through the various landscape green belt studies, and it is a strategic opportunity that will serve the council for now, and as you can say, potentially beyond the end of the planned period. But it is a well-defined site. It wouldn't have made sense to say, well, should we only take a half of it or a quarter of it? And as a strategic opportunity, it was felt that it warranted that, and it was locationally specific. It is immediately adjoining and indeed well related to, not just physically but visually as well, to the existing urban area and the existing North Farm development. So, appreciating the points that others have made, this was essentially, I think it's fair to say, a one-off opportunity, and to actually provide for the longer-term strategic employment needs of the area.
So the council's position on that one was, yes, there's this oversupply, or there would be this oversupply against the requirement, but actually there's site-specific reasons to amend the green belt boundary in this location at this moment in time for that site.
Yes, and I think potentially, of course, it is a minimum requirement as is housing, but when it comes to employment land, you need, and I've dealt with this a lot, need quite a good margin of flexibility, because different firms have different requirements in terms of what they're looking for. So you need a fair degree of flexibility to provide that choice.
But is that outline permission being granted? It's not subject to legal agreements or anything?
Yeah, it grants, and there are, as I said, detailed discussions for reserved matters application to be submitted to some first place.
Certainly a question, because I'm not familiar with that site. Was that allocated previously in the local plan of the previous Tunbridge Wells local plan?
It was allocated within the earlier versions of this local plan, but no, it was allocated in the previous site allocation statement plan.
So it was determined under very special circumstances.
Yes.
I think this is one of Pelican Wood's main concerns is, the council moving ahead of any local plan being in place and taking really critical decisions ahead of there being a local plan. I think that really, evidences that. It's difficult to follow how that site alone pretty much meets the overall employment needs based on the council's own evidence base. So 13.4 hectares compared to the 14 hectares that they say that the need is for the whole local plan period. So it's really difficult to follow how they've used their own evidence base, to arrive at that. And I think that from what I've seen, a lot of the employment on that site is for B2 and B8, although I think there's some E use on the site as well. So I don't know if the council can explain more about what the breakdown is between the different employment types, because it does relate back to the 2014 study where your original kind of employment needs originated. It does break it down, and that's how they arrive at that figure of somewhere around 14, I think.
So did you just to sort of put the question back to you, do you think that the local plan, because I don't want to get dragged too much into the planning permission that's been approved and the reasons for that, etc. So that's not within my control. But do you think the local plan should therefore be, when the council looks at employment in the wider context, and it was the old B or B2BA? Do you think that a local plan therefore should be actually saying, okay, well, we need X hectares of B8 storage and distribution, we need X hectares of general industrial, we need Y hectares of office, and then actually allocate land within those sort of type parameters, is that what you're saying that the plan should do, rather than just say sort of employment, and we just do it like that?
I think so. I think otherwise, because I think back in the old, structure plan days or the early local plan days, you would just have B1, B2, B8. I worked in Northamptonshire, and lo and behold, every single one of those sites went for strategic B8. So I think it is important to get that right, also for monitoring purposes, to know, what are you actually delivering against your needs. Similar to the conversation we had earlier about, housing, market housing versus affordable housing. I think it is important to set that out and make adjustments in the future if the council needed to, if they're seeing, stronger demand in certain sectors than others.
Do you think that would be effective? The council had a site, it was, Town A had a site, and it was allocated for, say, just B2 uses. Then a local employer came along and said, well, I need a storage and distribution yard, this fits the bill, it's got great access, it's going to create jobs for local people. Would that not be restricting a local business wanting to create jobs and employment there?
Well, sometimes there's other planning reasons for restricting. So particularly when you're talking about B8 distribution and strategic distribution, landscape impact, transport impacts, has a much different effect, much more significant effect than, a B1 light industrial or B2 kind of more localized sort of, industrial type of unit. So there's a reason for it, not just the kind of, being completely beholden to market demand, but there's planning reasons why it's important as well.
I'll draw attention to paragraphs 81, 82, and 83 of the NPPF, particularly in relation to the points that Mrs. Evans and drew attention to, paragraph 70 and Mr. Marlowe made around significant weight being placed on the need to support economic growth and productivity, wider opportunities for development, the approach taken to allow areas to build on their strengths, counter weaknesses, address challenges in the future, and then goes on to talk about positively, proactively encouraging sustainable economic growth, identify strategic sites for local and inward investments, to meet the strategy and meet anticipated needs over the plan period, and as Mr. Marlowe's relayed, potentially beyond. And then I think point D, it is particularly important as well, be flexible enough to accommodate needs not anticipated in the plan, allow for new and flexible working practices, and enable a rapid response to changes in economic circumstances. And then finally, planning policies and decisions should recognise and address specific locational requirements of different sectors. And Mr. Marlowe drew attention to the specific recommendations of the economic employment needs study in relation to King's Standing Way and the opportunities that provides, given its location relative to the existing employment areas of Tunbridge Wells and the strategic transfer. So we talked about this sort of over provision within the plan report, to put that, and the reasons for it. The second question, which really was question 8, was okay. So what are the consequences of doing that? So you said you've got only 14 hectares. Council plans for 26 hectares, whatever it is. So what are the implications of that? If all that employment land is taken up and all those businesses needed employment, would it mean dragging in employment from elsewhere and leading to sort of unsustainable commuting patterns, or what would happen? And how has council considered that if it has been?
Yeah, I think we will set this out in response to question 8 of the statement. I think, yes, we're recognising there is that oversupply of employment land, but there are a number of factors to consider. As Mr. Marlowe said, not all of the employment land may not all come forward during the local plan period. We've also considered that that there's local firms that are looking to expand within these allocations, so opportunities for local employment, aligning with population growth as well, population in the borough. But then also importantly, paragraph 78 in my statement referring to the Iceni Local Housing Needs Study 2020, where it acknowledges that there's currently net out commuting of over 2,000 residents from the borough. So through the allocation of sites, offers the opportunity to reverse that trend, providing a range of local employment opportunities for local people, and which is positive in sort of economic and sustainability terms.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just to come back to the King's Standing site, if I can refer to it. First of all, it's major development in the AONB also has been removed from Greenbelt. And the other point is it's actually on the market for sale right now. So I know, and this is kind of dichotomy here. The council is saying building or planning for King's Standing as a whole creates an oversupply situation. I think that's been agreed today. What I don't understand is if that's the case, why not put the bulk of housing along the A21 growth corridor close by, which was in the original issues and options as the preferred strategy. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is the council are building their employment needs strategy around that site, and yet the housing is going nowhere near it. Doesn't make sense.
So if I could just on the point about the land being for sale, recent communication with the CEO of U&I, the developers, they've confirmed that they are in discussions. They are the developer who, with the applicants, the outline consents, they are actively discussing the purchase of that land with the landowner. And as I've outlined previously, they are preparing the reserve matters application for the first phase. The intention is that will be occupied by, I believe, the second largest employer in the borough, who is currently located on the adjacent employment land. But it's just to provide that up-to-date, accurate information in relation to Kingston.
I think in answer to the second question, I think probably that leads into tomorrow's debate about strategies and why the council chose to direct housing and growth. I think Ms. Moll's answer sort of starts to sort of go into question 9 really, which is talks a lot about quantitative needs and the numbers behind it. But how did the council sort of consider qualitative needs and needs of local businesses, and was that taken into account in terms of the employment needs study and the evidence? It talks about workshops that you had and sort of interviews and participation from local businesses.
Yeah, as part of the economic needs study, as we mentioned, yes, there was stakeholder workshops where we had local businesses, agents, employers come in, and that was useful exercise to gain knowledge and sort of requirements from those local businesses. As Mrs. Smith said, she's also kept ongoing liaison with local businesses as part of her role in the economic development team. And I think it's important, the economic needs study does touch on this quite a lot in terms of qualitative needs. It's not just quantitative needs, but through the allocations that we're making in the local plan, providing flexibility and choice. There's opportunities for qualitative improvements as well in employment plans. So there's a number of approaches that have been advocated within the local plan, and I think broadly it's in relation to the allocation of sufficient sites for the employment growth. But then there's also the development management policies that are set out within the local plan as well, in relation to recognising the key employment areas, for retention of existing employment sites where they're well located. And there's policy ED2. I know we'll get to all these at a later session in terms of the development management policies, but important to highlight here as well, because they do when looking at the plan as a whole, provide that qualitative sort of element as well. And then there's other policies in relation to rural diversification, policy ED4, and conversion of rural buildings, ED5, and also the recognition of digital communications as well, so ED3. So I think qualitative sort of elements have been taken account of in formulating the local plan.
Thanks.
Thank you. So in response to your question, I think it leaves about 12 hectares of employment land being proposed at Paddock Wood, is I think where this leads to, because in the council's table 2, the site has already got permission that we heard has 13.4 hectares, and then there's the 2 Paddock Wood sites that make up the vast majority of the remaining proposed employment sites. Presumably those go hand in hand with the housing sites that are being proposed in Paddock Wood, and the population that's being sort of planned for that area as well. So I think it's really you have to look at the housing and the employment together, and I think that a key point that we've obviously raised is about flood risk, wastewater infrastructure, and we understand there's going to be sort of flood betterment and understanding how that works together really. So I mean that's the only other choice that's being provided by the council in terms of new employment sites apart from the Hawker Station Business Park. So it's all going to Paddock Wood, or you're going to be in the new site in Tunbridge Wells. So I think in terms of the implications, if you weren't going to have this additional employment requirement, land requirement of doubling what their supply, doubling what their need is, they've placed all of that basically into Paddock Wood.
Again, to come back again, probably start this search fund strategy tomorrow, but is there anything else?
I think, I'm not sure we want to create the strategy discussion when there'll be a wider audience. As we've said, there is a distribution element to this. Yes, it does. Obviously the strategic growth of Paddock Wood has a bearing. I think in terms of your point about qualitative need, and Mrs. Ennis made the point that not everyone wants new premises, new employment areas, retaining more existing staff, and that's issues with it. That's proved to be important. But also it's a question of actually looking at your successful business areas, and all of these estates areas relate to existing well-occupied employment areas. So that's part of a successful economic strategy. Clearly, in the case of Paddock Wood, the case is that it relates to the growth in that area and to the business needs of that area. But I'd say, I suspect my colleagues will want to sort of perhaps talk more about that as part of our holistic discussion on housing and employment.
So I was going to say exactly that. I think a couple of points, and without preempting further discussion, it's, I think, noting what Mr. Marlett said about the fact that Paddock Wood has an established employment location, and it's sort of taken that advantages that already exist. It's also, as Mr. Hayes noted, it's responding to the growth, because to provide a new carded settlement, and what we're seeking to do at Paddock Wood isn't just to provide an urban extension, it's to integrate fully with the existing town and transform the whole settlement as a garden settlement, it's appropriate to provide the employment uses alongside the housing. And, you know, as we will no doubt go into in detail at the Paddock Wood East Capel Day on matter 653, it has been planned for comprehensively. What I would just refer to briefly today is the SQW Paddock Wood Economics Opportunity Report, which is appended, or it's called document 3.66B. It's appended to the David Lock Associates Strategic Sites Master Planning and Infrastructure Study. And what that sought to do, because we didn't just ask David Lock to master plan the housing areas, it also master planned land to the north. And this evidence-based report does look specifically at the employment and economic opportunities of Paddock Wood and what is needed, and sort of recognising some recent trends in Paddock Wood and identifying how best to maximise the opportunity through the growth to enhance the vitality of the employment areas.
Okay, thank you. Any final comments, observations then on employment needs, Mr. Bennett?
Yes, sir. Just trying to keep the shackles on just for the topics for today, but it seems to me that Mr. Hayes has hit the nail on the head here, that essentially you're being asked to consider in terms of the topics today whether the policies are sound. And essentially it's developing 12 hectares, essentially the whole plan, essentially, at Paddock Wood. Now, if there is this doubling of supply versus demand, then that does question whether the plan is sound in respect of these policies that we're discussing today.
Presumably, and again, we'll talk on Friday to much selection methodology, presumably in terms of the allocations for employment land as well, based on what was actually submitted to the council and considered appropriate to do so as well. So presumably when you're looking at the distribution of employment land, it's not, yes, it might be ideal to have, say, 10 small sites spread evenly across your district, but unless those sites are put forward, then you have to consider, what sites to put forward and where they are. Mr. Hayes?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that the AL RTW 17 site, land adjacent to Longfield Road. I mean, no one forced the council to, determine that planning application. They preempted the local plan and determined that on their own. So without it being allocated and also putting it into the green belt. So I think for the council to have done that, to preempt the local plan, they've kind of set it up so that, they know that's their overall sort of employment land needs in one location. And we heard there's a lot of flexibility on that site as well. That may or may not be delivered over the plan period, but presumably you would think that it's going to be if it has a reasonable prospect of delivery, which really puts the ball into the Paddock Wood court, because you've already met your need within one site. So I think it's obviously something that needs to be looked at much more carefully, but I think the appropriateness of directing the growth towards Paddock Wood is obviously something we're going to talk about in much greater detail. And I think that the issues around flood risk need to be looked at holistically between both the employment and the housing. Hopefully the council isn't sort of determining these planning applications for employment at Paddock Wood whilst the local plan is going through and being examined, because I think that you don't have a coordinated approach to development in that area. There's already very significant issues with wastewater, surface flooding, when you don't put another 4,000 houses in 14 hectares of employment land in that location. So it certainly placed the local plan examination in a good position to look at all those issues collectively, rather than us having to look at each planning application on its own.
Okay, thank you. Any final comments to the council? Any further questions? Okay, well, that brings the end of
today's session. So it's a slightly earlier finish than previous sessions. For tomorrow, we're back in this room. Again, I think we're in this room throughout now, aren't we? I'll have a quick chat with Hannah before I leave, just in terms of seats. So it was an issue this morning, wasn't on the numbers of seats, we'll just make sure we've got enough chairs and seats available for tomorrow. And it's a slightly earlier start time tomorrow, so it's 9:30 start time tomorrow. But again, if anybody's got any questions, queries, please contact either Hannah when she's here or Charlotte via email. She'll respond to them. So, okay. Any questions?
Just a very brief one. So you mentioned this morning that you would speak to Hannah about the publication of the Matter 6 statements.
Yes.
At 7.
Yeah.
And whether they would be available today. We had
No,
a chance to.
Not had a chance to speak to Pro Ross, yeah, okay. I will speak to Pro Ross, so our statements and making sure that it's on the website as quickly as is possible.
I just ask again, so just simply because as we're finding throughout the process, there's an overlap between various stages and discussion sessions. So that it was in that context. They may be relevant in some degree to what we discussed tomorrow and Friday.
Okay, we'll adjourn for the day, then we'll